So you'll be pleased to know this morning it's not just me delivering a set of slides to you as I normally do. So I'm going to be doing the intro piece, and Andy's going to be then running through the actual sort of hands-on demo of how you can optimize your virtual machine spend. So just before I hand over to Andy, just for those of you that are not existing customers of ours, then just bear with me a second. Then a little bit about who we are and I guess why we're doing Microsoft Week Wales. So Risk are headquartered in Llandudno in North Wales. So we've been in business for just over 20 years now, and through that time we've always been involved in cloud services, primarily around security initially, security and disaster recovery, now much more around productivity and agility. And obviously agility, we mean moving systems, services, virtual machines into the cloud with products like Azure, which will be the focus for today. And then productivity, pretty much Teams and Office 365 at the moment. We look after about 25,000 end users across about 1,000 companies, and we also work with about 250 IT partners dotted across the UK. Just very quickly, talking about who we work with. So obviously Microsoft, as you'd expect, are a big part of what we do as a company. So we're a Microsoft Gold partner, as you can see at the top, and probably 80% of what we do revolves around Microsoft services, whether that is Office 365 or Azure primarily, and a little bit of Dynamics. We also partner with a couple of other organisations that I'll mention very briefly. So WaveNet is one of them. They add the telephony, contact centre, call recording capability to what we do with Teams primarily. Also Redstore we've been working with for most of those 20 years. They provide the server cloud backup and disaster recovery service that we use for both traditional on-premise and hosted servers, but also now more so cloud to cloud with products like Office 365 cloud to cloud backup. Protos also are running, have run a session with us, and I'll cover some of the other sessions that we've been running this week at the end. But Protos we work with around particularly cyber security, so Cyber Essentials, IASME, those kind of areas. So what does Azure give to your business? So this is obviously a slide I've taken from Microsoft. I just really wanted to summarize kind of their view of what Azure gives you as a business and your organization. And as you'd expect with Microsoft, lots of big numbers in there: global access, lower total cost of ownership, scalability, innovation, etc. The ones we're going to focus on this morning are really scalability and lower total cost of ownership. So when they talk about scalability, it's obviously the ability to rapidly scale up and down services, switch services off when you don't need them, and obviously total cost of ownership compared to running those services in a traditional way by investing in hardware and hosting it on site. I guess it also comes into agility as well, so that ability to scale services up and down, and that flexibility and benefit that you get with Azure has a flip side clearly, that that infinite scalability effectively also has a cost associated to it. So a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the work that Andy does with our customers and our partners, which we'll talk about, is how to manage that and keep control of that and optimize your costs. So great that Azure is infinitely scalable. You can build these massive virtual machines, as many of them as you want. But as I say, the flip side of that is, how do I control my costs as a customer? And as always with Microsoft and Azure in particular, it's huge. It's everywhere. So obviously you can run those services in the UK region, but also effectively anywhere in the world, particularly US and Europe as well. These are obviously Microsoft figures, so I'm not going to justify them, but certainly they've got about 13 million organizations using Azure AD, definitely, because obviously that's the way that most people or everybody logs into Office 365. But whichever way you cut it, it's a massive platform with a massive install base, and the benefit for you, whatever size customer you are, or if you're a partner, is that obviously you benefit from that massive investment in both the scale of Azure, but also the functionality that you can deliver, which you probably wouldn't be able to access as a small to medium sized business in the past without this sort of infinitely scalable, flexible platform. And similar to Office 365, obviously Office 365 delivers services that you probably wouldn't have had access to as a small business. So all the investment that Microsoft put in, all of the features and functions that they add into Azure are available to you as a customer. And talking about the number of features and functions, again, this slide I just cut off their Azure website, and the bits I wanted to highlight here is this 200 plus. So it's mind-blowing really just how many different services are available now in Azure. I think when it first launched there were about 20. About 3 years ago there were about 80. So I'm not expecting you to get your head around all of these 200 plus different services, and certainly the ones that probably 95% of our customers are using are virtual machines, obviously the big one. Windows Virtual Desktop is a fairly new service, but something that we've seen more and more interest in. SQL, hosted SQL, and again, Andy will cover some of these as we go through. And out of those 200 plus, what we are going to focus on is pretty much 4 of those services, which again make up the bulk of what we do with customers as a business, and also what our customers are interested in using, obviously. So virtual machines, the storage that goes alongside those virtual machines, the networking of how you connect to them and how you connect them together, and then services like managed disk to improve performance. So as I say, you'll be pleased to know that you're not going to have to listen to me deliver PowerPoint all day. So I'm going to hand over to Andy now, who's going to run you through some of the tools that you can take advantage of. So Andy, do you want to just introduce yourself, mate, while I just flick the video over? And I'll take you off mute, actually. Sorry, I also muted you. 2 seconds. That'll serve me right, won't it? If you want to try and unmute yourself, I think I've probably permanently muted you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can.
Yeah, you're good.
Fantastic. Okay. So again, thank you for the introduction, Mark. It's wonderful for you to put some PowerPoint slides together. As you've alluded to, I won't be doing any PowerPoints today. I'm going to attempt to do a live demonstration of the Azure calculator. But to introduce myself first, if I may, I look after the majority of our partners here at Risk IT, and I do quite often get involved in the majority of the direct deals that we do where Azure is involved or Office 365 licensing needs optimizing. So today, most of the focus, I'm going to go through a couple of examples, but to sort of set the scene, commercially, I live and breathe it. I like money, I like numbers, I'm good at maths. So I spend a lot of time in the Azure calculator working things through with partners, but where a lot of the time I find it falls over, the people who are actually doing the provisioning, jumping into the actual Azure portals and choosing which virtual machines, which disks, which network types, there's a disconnect, and that's where things can slightly go awry. So what I want to do is to demonstrate that a little bit. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. And hopefully that should come through in a moment or two.
Yeah, just give it a second. It's not appeared yet.
There we go. I think that should be coming through.
Yeah, all good, mate.
So as Mark said, there are hundreds and thousands of different types of things that you can choose in Azure. The featured ones are primarily the ones that most people are going to play with, but I have prepared one. So what we essentially have here, I'm going to put a little network together. So most of the time people put their toe in the water with Azure and extend their on-site infrastructure. So we're going to have a domain controller. Now that could be a standalone domain controller or attached to your on-premise for migration purposes or to add resiliency, for example. But what you'll see here is a nice little computer. It's 2 CPUs, 8 GB of RAM, Windows OS. And what we've done is we've chosen one of those for a full period of a month. Now, as with Azure, you can be billed in, well, minutes, seconds, hours, days. But just to make this nice and simple for this illustration, I'm going with one simple full month of this virtual machine being up and accessible 24/7 for that entire month. Now, your servers, what you're paying for is CPU and RAM. You also need disk, of course, for their operating system and anything else that you want to install upon it. And most techies will agree that a solid state hard drive is absolutely worth every single penny. So I tend to opt for the premium solid state hard drives, and you see there 128 gig SSD and the price for it. I am going to go through this relatively quickly because it's illustration of the points. That's the key point here, not necessarily the particular specs. So we've got that particular virtual machine. The customer also requires some storage, so some file storage, nice and simple, roughly 1 terabyte thereof. And what you'll see is I haven't chosen a solid state hard drive. I've chosen a standard hard disk drive, and you'll see this point here, storage transactions. And in English, what that basically is, every time a file is accessed, read, moved, changed, touched, basically, and that could be by antivirus solutions doing scans. It could be your backup solution backing up the data and taking it out of Azure. But every single time a file's touched, then that is a storage transaction, and there's a little ticker that just obviously tots up the costs. These are huge numbers. So each 10,000 transactions cost you 0.04 of a pence, which sounds like absolutely nothing. But on 1 terabyte, if you had 1 million files, for example, it can ramp up quite quickly if you're having hourly scans or hourly backups, and all those 1 million files are changing on an hourly or 2 hourly or 3 hourly basis. So I always apply quite dramatically so that there is good scope there for the amount of costs that are likely to come through when the bill finally does. The next virtual machine we're going to look at here is a nice simple application virtual machine, a little bit more spec. The particular application here, it is relatively heavy on the RAM more than the CPU. So as you can see, I've chosen a D series virtual machine with 8 cores and 32 gig. Again, a full month, and you will see the particular cost point there for that particular virtual machine. Likewise, premium SSD, that one's a little bit bigger, obviously, to house the application as well. And obviously, having your app on an SSD gives the obvious benefits of speed. Under bandwidth, you'll see that there's very little going on in there, and for the first 5 gig there's no charge anyway. But the next section, of course, VPN, security, paramount. Azure is huge, as Mark very eloquently put it, but therefore it's also a huge target for all of the horrible people there who try to ruin everyone's day in IT. So you do have to secure anything you put into Azure. It is built in the most secure fashion, but Microsoft are securing themselves, not necessarily you or us as the customers. It is our responsibility to provision services in Azure and to ensure that they are secured appropriately. It's not on Microsoft, it's on you. Microsoft's ecosystem and their side is absolutely fine. We can use their certifications, but your security is yours and it will be as secure as you make it. And obviously that's something that we help with day in, day out. So you'll see here, we've gone with a virtual private network. So in Azure, you can have essentially your firewall, and that connects to your on-site firewall, or if you have remote workers, they can directly VPN from their Windows 10 machine into Azure. You will see 720 hours. For some reason, it doesn't give you the option to just show one full month, roughly 24 hours, 30 days a month, 720 hours, and you can see the fee for it. Now, this particular VPN, I've gone with the GW1. That gives 650 megasecond throughput. There is a much cheaper basic VPN, which you'll see is around about 20 quid. But the GW1 gives you, well, improved throughput. There are additional security features you can apply, and it is typically, for most customers we use, the entry point. You are able to get virtual machines and actually use, like Meraki, for example. You can have a virtual machine that is essentially a firewall appliance up in Azure and basically use your own firewall and your own VPN for that. So for this example, again, GW1, roughly £100, copious amounts of site-to-site tunnels included. You can buy more if needed. So I'm going to sketch through this relatively quickly again, and I've typically put 250 gigabytes per month through the VPN as an estimate. Right, £818.79 per month. Any of the technical people on the session will go, goodness gracious me, for that level of spec server and a physical one at that, I could buy one of those every 3 or 4 months. Where's my cost saving? I thought Azure was supposed to be really great at getting bang for your buck and all of these things, and it is, but only if you do it in the right way. So this example, before I flip across again to remind, 2 CPUs and 8 gig of RAM. So I'm going to go across from my sensible spec but not optimized to example 2 here. And on a live demo, you pray it loads, and it does. Thank you very much. So you'll notice that I've got 2 cores and 8 gig of RAM, almost identical, It's a different flavor of server. And now the B series are burstable, essentially. So what they assume is that you're not consuming all of those resources all of the time. And on a domain controller, the techies will agree with me that it'll trundle along quite nicely. Every now and again, there's a little bit of requirement and a peak. But a B series, typically from our experience, works very well for AD servers, little file servers, and so on. There is a big change here. If any of you picked up on it before, we'd nominated to go pay as you go. And on a particular server where it is going to be available 24/7, pay as you go is a little bit silly. By swapping to a reserved instance, in English, what you're telling Microsoft is, I'm going to keep that server for a period of time. I'm going to give you our money every single month, whether that's for 1 year or 3. And as a consequence to you committing to Microsoft, they'll discount the actual price that you pay. So again, just to show that, just by going and telling Microsoft you're going to keep it for a while, that particular cost from $55.50 to $23.69. So there's a nice reduction there. You may also notice hybrid benefit. I'll explain this one on the later one because it makes more sense. But to continue down, manage disk in exactly the same way, my premium SSD. Bandwidth is not relevant at this point because I'll be going through the VPN. Storage accounts. So with my terabytes worth of file store, in theory, most of the time where we've looked at people's actual utilization of their file storage, we find that although they may have a terabyte, that very seldom, or most of the time actually, 10%, 15, 20% is actually accessed frequently. The remaining can almost be archived away. And in Azure, because you have all of the different things that Azure can provide, you have options. So to optimize your actual usage once you've moved into Azure or prior means that you can actually benefit from the other options presented. So that storage account has changed from a managed disk where you have a particular disk from Microsoft. You don't have to worry about RAID. You don't have to worry about the redundancy too much of that disk. But what we're looking at here is a storage account that is essentially blob storage or file storage here. So this can be attached to your server in pretty much the same way, but the assumption is that the data isn't accessed, or all of it isn't accessed as frequently as it would be on a managed disk. And as a consequence, the cost is dramatically cheaper. So analyzing your data, analyzing the utilization of what you've got in Azure are ways that you can further optimize the costings. So I'm going to try and start everybody off on the right footing, but to make the point that once you're in Azure, it doesn't stop. Bigger organizations have resource, they have people who in theory can be almost solely into managing their Azure and optimizing and getting performance improvements and so on and so forth. The smaller the customer, the more often you're actually pulled from pillar to post and you're expected to be an expert in absolutely everything in IT. So a lot of the time, this sort of optimization gets put on the back burner. And that is a consequence of time, I suppose, more than anything else. But what RIS tend to do is we make sure that we are setting expectations that early doors, we can move you all in sundry in and we can optimize as we go. And we start to give illustrations of how we'll optimize that. And this is where the Azure calculator comes into its own. So again, moving on, the application virtual machine. Now you'll notice again, different virtual machine here. I have dropped from 8 cores to 4, but I've got the same amount of RAM. On this particular application, that works quite nicely. You will see, if I go back to pay-as-you-go and the license included as part of the pay-as-you-go solution, that particular server, 261.16, by reserving for 3 years and applying hybrid benefit, that's huge. That reduction is massive. The reserved instance I've explained. Hybrid benefit. When you're pay as you go into Azure, Microsoft assume that you don't have any licenses and that you're going to leave at any moment and come back sometimes, and it's on the metered method. So if you go into reserve instance and tell Microsoft you're staying for this particular period of time, it does make sense to look at hybrid benefit because you can see the cost saving there quite clearly. It's £100 a month for bringing your own license. The obvious question to ask is, how do I bring my own license? Microsoft have introduced the facility to buy operating system licenses for use in Azure via the Cloud Solution Provider program that, of course, we're a member of. And the costings for it, for a server with less than 8 cores, £557 is the purchase price for 3 years. And as just to really hammer it home, £100 a month saving for an initial outlay of 557. So 6 months paid for itself, and then you've got 30 months of benefiting. There are other options if you want to bring your own license, and particularly education and charity customers we found do benefit from huge discounts from Microsoft in terms of their volume licensing. The key point to be aware of is that volume licensing need to have software assurance so that you can use those licenses in Azure. And again, these conversations are the ones that we have day in, day out. I'm more than happy to go through these with anyone who'd wish to talk to us about Azure. Managed disk, exactly the same. 0.5 terabyte premium SSD. And as I'm jumping in here as well, let me just show you the differences. If we have a storage requirement that may go up to 0.5 terabyte, you don't have to start there. We can start with the 0.25 terabyte, pay for that 2, 3, 4 months later as our needs grow. You jump up to the 0.5 terabyte, and all of this can fundamentally be done on the fly, and it is, again, as Mark alluded to earlier on, scalable, flexible, and agile enough to cope with your needs and demands. VPN gateway, exactly the same, no differences at all. And right, so the bit that really matters, £289.91. I'm going to take you back to the other example. So that was just shy of 300 a month. Sensible spec, unoptimized, 818. Now, that's incredibly quick, and I will apologize for going through it at that speed, but this is what we do with our partners and our customers almost on a day-to-day basis for 2 reasons. We'll spec with the technical department as to the needs and requirements. Also, budgets come into things, unfortunately. But what we have to do is be clever with people's spend, and all organizations, especially at the moment with the horrific year that everyone's had, every penny counts, and technical people, they want as much resource as they can possibly get for their own benefits and the benefits of the organization. Staff tend to be one of the biggest overheads businesses have. So the more efficient IT can be, the more benefit and the more efficient, in theory, staff should be, and your ROI comes from that. So again, what we find is you can produce a quotation, you can produce a budgetary request based on the Azure calculator, you can get sign off on that, everyone's happy, we proceed. And then lo and behold, we jump into the Azure actual portal where system administrators, technical people go in and actually start provisioning. Now, in the onset of Corona and lockdown and all of that, what we found were the number of options available in the Azure portal were somewhat limited. Now, in the calculator, there are absolutely hundreds of different specs and flavor of virtual machines. I mean, really frightening ones as well. I mean, look at this, £20,000 a month for a virtual machine, 208 cores, nearly 3,000 gigabytes. It's crazy. That would not have been available when we were in March and April time. I can assure you of that, because everybody had jumped into Azure. So that takes me to a good opportunity to show you something else that we can do in Azure to optimize what people need. Now, this domain controller, for example, we want to keep that one. It's a domain controller. I want it available all the time. My application server, it's actually only the finance team, for example, who use this particular line of business application. And those guys, thankfully for them, they work between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock Monday to Friday. So we don't necessarily need this server up 24/7, 365. So we change that to hours, and then we do a rough calculation for working hours. Oh, not that many, thank goodness. And roughly, if we give 240 hours per month, hopefully you saw then that the price changed, and again, rather dramatically. We can still apply things like hybrid benefit if you wish, and again, you can see the cost has changed, and that is reflected of the amount of hours the machine's in use for. Reserved instance, however, there's a judgment call to make, because if the number of hours required compared to the reserved instance price, you've got to weigh it up, because by a reserved instance, you are telling Microsoft you're going to have it 24/7, 365. So there's very little point. Well, there's no point switching it off. So that's the judgment call to make. is my 240 hours cheaper than actually just telling Microsoft I'm going to have it 24/7 for a certain period of time? And as we can see here, it is. So we've gone from 308.64 back to pay as you go, £148. Apply a bit of hybrid benefit as well, and we're into £83 per month. And that gets us our application server in a much more cost-effective manner. The downside of this, if we're doing what they call runbooks, so that is automated switch off, switch on at times that you've predefined, the issue that you sometimes have, if there is a huge spike in demand due to a global pandemic, sorry, that resource has been consumed by somebody else. You've asked Microsoft to switch it off and on, but if the resource isn't there to switch it on, it doesn't come up. Now, we actually had this with a customer, unfortunately for us, and a rather large customer as it was, and they'd, about 4 months prior to Corona, had moved into Azure, and they were absolutely ecstatic. We had, it was a rather large opportunity, as I say, so we had a combination of runbooks, reserved instance, hybrid benefit. It was an opportunity I really enjoyed because managing expectations, setting the scene, and actually seeing all the invoices coming through and being almost, without being rather arrogant, being almost to the penny on what was a very large opportunity. I was very, very pleased with myself, and obviously the customer was really chuffed as well. But 3 or 4 months in, a little bit of a wobble over at Azure UK South, and the resources weren't there for the particular server that they were looking for. So thankfully, about 12 seconds after the server didn't come up, our notification system picked it up, and the technical team, well, immediately jumped on it and jumped on me to say, okay, we need to provision a different server. Which one? So we're aware of the specifications needed. The customer typically need 8 CPU, 32 gig of RAM, for example. So what we did, instead of a D series virtual machine, we went through the calculator at the same time as the technical team going through the actual Azure provisioning portal, and we found a comparable machine. It just so happened this particular one had enough CPU and double the RAM for them, but the price differential wasn't huge. So technical for that moment in time nominated that we choose a different server that was available that didn't have a huge swing in commercials for them. And that's what we did. So half an hour later, there or thereabouts, when we're having a conversation with the actual customer to explain what's happened and the action we've taken since, we explained in detail that this, given the pandemic, is something that's concerning us, and to go through this process every morning, we were scared, quite frankly, of the scenario where there wasn't a suitable box to choose, a suitable virtual machine spec. So in conjunction with the customer, we looked at the benefit or the saving they were currently having by having office hours only for some of their servers, as opposed to reserving them. And the differential in price was negligible to the customer. You know, with the number of users they had, the worry was far more. They just, for the 150 quid extra it was per month, they just weren't bothered. They just wanted that peace of mind. So we reserved it, and the problem was settled and solved. So you do have to be careful, is my point. If you're doing runbooks, if something goes awry, you need to know very, very quickly, and you need to be in a position where you can react without it either costing the earth or the customer effectively being down or not having the resources they need at that particular time. Now, credit where credit's due to Microsoft. I don't think anyone foresaw Corona properly. They did fix the capacity issues in Azure UK South and UK West, to be fair, because that one did take a hiding as well. And that was done, I think, within 6 to 8 weeks. And we've not come across a scenario where we've gone to provision a particular virtual machine and that one's not actually been available to us. So we're doing well in Azure, but it's so difficult for IT system admins who are living and breathing a particular Azure portal, and the technical one doesn't show you anything about commercials. So you can just choose one virtual machine or the other, and it doesn't highlight, oh my goodness gracious me, that's going to cost you another £400 a month, or whatever the scenario would be. And that's where it tends to go wrong for people. The next point really is when bills have arrived and analysis is requested upon them from finance typically. It's a laborious process, and the amount of detail that comes through from Azure is phenomenal. You will find that the majority of the lines on the the costs and the breakdowns from Microsoft. A few pennies here, a few pennies there, but there's so many lines, it's ridiculous. But the big parts of cost are things like your virtual machine, your managed disk, storage, and the 4 key areas that Mark said we were going to go through today. Now, this is a live demo. I have used the Azure storage calculator here, and as I say, I do this day in, day out. Majority of the time, we do it once. We'll produce a quotation off the back of it. Scenarios change, situations change, budgetary constraints kick in sometimes. So it's always a bit of a moving feast. And even when we get to the point of a customer wanting to actually provision, then usually myself, I sit alongside technical, or virtually as we do nowadays, and we go through, and if there's a variation from the quote to what's available in the portal, we can quickly make a judgment call to find a suitable virtual machine. If there is a tweak in price that's going to be enough to cause an issue, then of course we liaise with customer, and everyone's expectations are set and managed appropriately. Now, the last piece I think I'm going to go through here before we come back to Mark and perhaps open up the Q&A. If we have this scenario where we're trying to manage expectations, and in sales I find that most of the time that is what we do. We try to manage expectations for all the departments, from technical, professional services, accounts and finance, and everybody wants to be aware of what the bill's going to be. But nobody will really want to commit to a completely new system without trying it first. So onboarding, testing, migration, all of these things, utilize the hours. That's the key point that I take. So we go pay as you go. We don't apply the hybrid benefit, but what we do while we're in pre-production, we're spinning servers up, we're doing some work on them, and then if we're not physically and actively working on them, we switch them off. The storage, when you're doing a migration, of course, you can start pulling your data in. Unfortunately, if you switch your server off, the disks still exist. So you do incur costs, but how we set the scene with our end users, we'll give them the quotation based on this is what it's going to be. Once you commit to us that you are happy, so we will put you on pay as you go. We will do a proof of concept. So we will move and provision or migrate you to Azure. We will leave you and pay as you go for a very short period of time, admittedly. And once you commit back to us that you are happy with the performance, you're happy with the commercials, at that point, one of the guys or girls from technical, they jump into the Azure control panel, they press the buttons, they order the licenses and apply the licenses for hybrid benefit, for example. And at that point, when everyone has tried before they've necessarily committed for 3 years, comfortable, happy, expectations managed, then you hit the button and you reserve your reserved instance and your Azure infrastructure for the next few years. And I think that's probably a good point to ask the question, has there been any questions as I've gone through the run through? Typically with partners, they hit me on the fly and it throws me off a tangent, but open forum, have any questions come through? Mark, are you still with me?
I am with you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah, there's been a few actually. I've done my best to answer a couple of them, but there's a few that I probably need you to take a look at for me. So the ones that came through was, can you change your mind once you've reserved a reserved instance? And I think you probably covered some of that.
Oh, no, it's a good one, because depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist, which way to approach this one first. So I'm going to go pessimistic to start with. We've provisioned into Azure, we've told Microsoft we're going to keep it, and we're an events company and it's not been a great year. I've committed to Microsoft and I actually don't need anywhere near the resources that I thought I was going to. That potentially is a problem, but what Microsoft have built into this reserved instance piece, at least, if you actually decide that you don't need that amount of resource, you can allocate it elsewhere, or if you do choose to reduce, you do get a refund. Now, Microsoft will penalise. For example, if you've committed to £1,000 a month for 36 months, a month in, you say, the world's changed. Unfortunately, I don't need that amount of research. I don't need any. I want all of it back. You'll get near as damn it £800 back per month. Your reservation, you will get penalised 20%. That's the key point. Now, obviously, the optimistic view is you're not an events company and your needs are exploding. You need more than you originally scoped that you would. Well, in that scenario, Microsoft will quite happily let you go from a particular spec to a higher spec, use the amount of money that you've told them you're going to commit to on a monthly basis towards that. You will be required to pay the additional premium, but you don't necessarily lose anything. Microsoft are just happy that you're committing to more. So they penalize you if you're committing to less, taking 20% for themselves. And of course, if you're going up, they are more than happy to take your funds from you, quite frankly, and provide you with the wonderful service that Azure gives.
Yeah, so I did the analogy of a mortgage, early termination, that or a loan, where you've kind of committed for a number of years, but you can pay it off early with a bit of a penalty. So obviously there's still massive savings to be made there. Yeah, the other one that I attempted to answer was, can anyone access the pricing tool, or is it partners only?
No, not at all. What I've actually gone through here is available to absolutely everybody. Let me just delete. So this is just the Azure homepage, pricing, there it is, Azure pricing, calculator. Sorry, there we go. And in you pop.
So yeah, so I had a good go at that one. There's a couple more actually, which we might be able to. Is hybrid benefit only relevant to Windows Server, or are there any other products that it's relevant to?
Cracking question, actually.
It's a Microsoft licensing thing, isn't it?
I am sad, and I do read up about these things. It's recently changed. So initially, absolutely, Mark, as you say, hybrid benefit, because you pay as you go, and it's a Windows operating system that we've chosen here, Microsoft assume that you haven't got a license, so they charge you for one. Now, you can choose, of course, different operating systems, and if we choose Linux, for example, then you get a different box here to choose, well, quite a few different Linux variations, CentOS, Red Hat, Ubuntu, and so on. Some of these are quite handy as well. Some of the SAP, Business One or HANA. We've also got SUSE as well in here. So with these, CentOS, it's Ubuntu, they're open source, so there's no premium to pay for licensing from those, but they have very recently brought out, and I think it's the Red Hat ones. Yeah, there you go. So if you have a Red Hat estate, for example, and you do have your own licensing you can bring in, then you can bring them in, and of course the price changes accordingly.
Okay, brilliant. So the answer is no, it's not just Microsoft then. Did I ask you this question already, or did you cover this? It was the question around what services can be reserved. Is it just virtual machines?
Actually, Mark, let me show one thing before I do come into that one. Okay. I forgot, apologies. So under the Windows section, type OS only, you may notice there, you can actually take a SQL box. So this is a nice Windows 10, well, sorry, Server 19 or Server 16 you can choose, Data Center or Standard Edition I might add, and you can choose to have SQL pre-installed effectively. And you'll notice a new options appeared here, and also be very careful. Very, very careful. SQL Enterprise is hugely expensive, and you choose which version of SQL you want. Most of the time, if it's not SQL Express and you have to install it yourself, we find SQL Standard is the most common one. And the costings for the license, again, you can either have it on pay as you go, or if you have your own SQL Standard license with software assurance, or a SQL license bought via the cloud solution provider program, then you can bring that into Azure and not have to pay the premium. I may frighten one or two people here, but this is based on a 2-core virtual machine for SQL. SQL in Azure is licensed per core. If you happen to have a 8-core SQL box, that'll probably do for the time being. Look at that. So yeah, your SQL Server licensing, again, anyone with SQL Standard or Enterprise will know it's not cheap, but £435 a month for that license for 8 cores. As many users as you like, quite frankly, but 8 cores is the limiting factor there. Right, sorry, to move on to your actual question, Mark, apologies.
Thank you.
What else can we reserve and get discount upon? Right, so manage disks, bandwidth, storage. There are certain things that you can, certain things that you can't. With Azure, there are certain disks that you can reserve. Primarily though, excuse me, primarily it is CPU and RAM, because from Microsoft's point of view, the commitment they're making, of course, is in the security and the boundaries and all of that sort of stuff, but they have to put servers in, and lots of them. And typically when they're buying their servers, of course, they're getting certain amounts of RAM, certain amounts of CPU, and the certain specs of server. They have copious amounts of disk. But those are the two real things, your actual server, the CPU and RAM part of it, and the disks. Those are the things that people are consuming more and more and more of, that Microsoft need to manage the amount of servers coming into the data centers to meet what is ever growing demand. So they need to know, so that they can manage their own pipeline of hardware acquisition, quite frankly, to know what servers that are in use now are going to continue to be in use, as opposed to, oh, this is just a spike in need, it may not be long term, to help them balance how the needs of the world are changing. It helps for them to get commitment from people. So reserved instances for fundamentally virtual machines, certain types of disk, not all, as you've seen there. I tried to grab a couple and show you, but majority of the time what we're looking to reserve are the actual virtual machines that you're using. You can reserve managed SQL databases, and there is so much in Azure. It's really each opportunity on its merits, and each customer requirement on its merits needs to be looked at individually, and based on what the needs are, it's only sensible to optimize what you can. But again, it's about understanding customer requirements. It's about understanding where the business actually stands in terms of, are we anticipating growth? Are we seasonal? What the working practices of the staff? And there's just so much to it. But the more detail we go into, the further we can go with the optimization. And once somebody's moved into Azure, that's not the end of it. Far, far from it. You can go into Azure, and there are optimization sections in the Azure portal for partners. A lot of the time, from my experience, you get better as you go on. The more you do it, the more time you can put to look at it and interrogate data and performance and usage, the more you can hone and refine. So it's always a balancing act between the amount of resource you've got to look into it, the amount of discounting you can use to your benefit. And if you don't have, excuse me, should have brought my charger really. And if you don't have the actual time to do it, then with the greatest of respect, probably the best thing to do is to work with a partner who has more experience and can hold your hand and guide you through it. And it's then the onus is put on them to manage the expectations from a budgetary point of view. And that's a Pepsi challenge we have every day, and we quite enjoy it.
Yeah, I was going to say, so the advice is, if you're worried about using it or using it for the first time, then talk to us. We can, or you can also, or one of us can help guide them through it. Yeah, brilliant, mate. Thank you for that. Yeah, one other one which might be a little bit unfair and probably a difficult one to answer off the cuff really is any examples of comparing Azure pricing long term compared to, let's say, traditional UK data center hosting or on premise. Have we done any work around that kind of analysis?
Microsoft have done all sorts. They've done loads, and historically we've always partnered up with a UK data center provider. And given the standards that we hold ourselves to, our UK-based data center, they are one of, if not the best and most secure in the UK. They are phenomenal. They're the security operations center for things like the fire brigade and police. So if there's ever something really kicking off in the country, then our data center needs to be operational. So they are, quite frankly, the best of the best from a data center point of view. Their technology that they use is fantastic, but they're also not Microsoft, and the scope and breadth of Microsoft services are phenomenal. So our UK data centers, we have various and quite a few customers in there, and very, very happy. Now, the reason I set the scene about the quality of the particular data center solution we use is because there's always a premium to pay. Our data centers are actually replicated between two geographically dispersed data centers to give a highly available set of infrastructure for our customers. But the point is that there is a premium to pay for that. And when people are comparing UK data center to Azure, it's almost just as difficult to make it a fair comparison. So our data centers compared with, for example, just Azure UK South, typically once optimized, Azure comes out far cheaper, but you're only paying for one data center. You don't have that resiliency. It is UK South. Everyone's in Azure. So
yeah,
and
you can build additional resilience into the Azure solution though, can't you, if you design it that way?
Absolutely. You can utilize, for example, UK South and UK West. But typically with Azure, if you're doing that and you're doing load balancing, for example, and replication between the two, you need to double the infrastructure that you're paying for in Azure. And I'm not really giving you a direct answer to this question because it's comparing apples with apples. Anybody can go and buy I don't know, 8-core, 32 gig of RAM physical dedicated server in a rack somewhere in the UK, 150 quid a month or something like that. It's not really a fair comparison with Azure and the scope and breadth and flexibility it has. It's nowhere near as resilient, as redundant, as scalable as, and all those messages you popped up before. So it's comparing apples with apples. And to touch on comparing a physical server on site with a data center or Azure solution, we've been doing that for years as well. And it's not just 5,000 quid for a server versus a few £100 a month or £1,000 a month in Azure. That's not the comparison. Total cost of ownership. It's electric, it's power, it's cooling, it's backup, it's downtime, it's overhead for IT staff having to run around if oh my goodness gracious me, there's a disk in my RAID array that's failing. All of that is taken care of for you by a team of trained, qualified professionals in the Azure data center.
So safe to say there are a lot of hidden costs that you need to take into account when you're comparing Azure to traditional on-prem hosting.
Absolutely. There's always cause as well. We haven't quite often, and we will be upfront and transparent with customers. If an Azure virtual machine or Azure infrastructure or data center infrastructure isn't necessarily the right solution for the customer, and an on-site server or a hybrid environment is better for performance needs, requirements, and budgetary perhaps, then we will always be upfront and tell the customers that's the case, and do so quite often, as most of the partners will attest to.
Very good. One other final question that's popped in here that says third-party tools. I don't know whether you've looked at any, or whether you used any, or whether you'd prefer to just stick to the Microsoft pricing tool itself rather than any third-party tools.
Oh no, I see. I thought that was going to go into a different tangent actually.
Well, it might do. Go on. It might be my interpretation of the question.
I might do both actually, and answer two different questions.
Take it as a tangent if you want.
Okay. So tools for pricing up in Azure. I've used the Azure calculator for a number of years and I'm very familiar with it. Mark, you mentioned Windows virtual desktops a little while ago. They're quite complicated to price up because, again, they have all the scalability, flexibility built in. We have come across a third-party tool that actually you can define and dictate how many users, whether you think they're heavy, do they need additional graphics cards and things like that, and it'll spit out a per monthly cost for you. Personally, people stick with what they know, and as I say, I've used the calculator and gone through the process to the point where all the invoices come through from Microsoft, and we've correlated those again. So it works for me, and that's therefore why I continue to use it. The question I thought you were about to ask, Mark, is tools to get up to Azure, migration tools and such.
Yeah, that's right.
It depends on the opportunity. We did one yesterday, as it happens. So a customer on site, one site, growing nicely, wanted a bit more resiliency and also people starting to work from home a bit more. And they had some storage that they need to keep for compliance reasons, but it was consuming an awful lot of data on their rather expensive SAN, their storage area network on site. So what we do.
I seem to have lost Andy here, so I'll just pop my content back up and finish off on the slides. So apologies for that. Just bear me a second. Technology sent to test us. There we go. So we should be able to see my.
I can see it.
Don't worry about my video. There we go. Okay, see my slides at least. So I'll carry on and finish off with the slides anyway. I think Andy's machine's probably finally given up on its power, but I think we'd pretty much gone through all of the questions that I'd got in the chat anyway, to be honest. So anything else that we'll kind of compile those questions anyway and put them into a little Q&A document to send across to everyone after the call. So I mean, the only bit I was going to finish off with, if I get him to rejoin, and I think just again highlighting the that Andy covered during the session, there are 3 key ways that you can actually optimize your costs in Azure. So reserved instance being the obvious one, committing 1 year or 3 years to Microsoft that you'll use those machines so they can actually plan and scale the network to match it. Obviously, Azure hybrid benefit, if you want to bring your sort of OS, whether that's Windows Server or other OS, into Azure and leverage those licenses, and then the runbook automation, which you kind of touched on. It didn't go into too much detail. I mean, obviously the whole runbook automation side is, kind of a subject in its own right. So there's a few complexities there, but we do use that with a lot of our customers. I think you mentioned one that we had a little bit of a blip with in the early days of the pandemic, when I think the UK data centers in particular were under pressure. You're back on, Andy, so don't worry, I've carried on, don't worry.
To be honest, I'm slightly catching my breath, having very quickly run to get my charge. Apologies, apologies everybody.
No, it's all right. It's to be honest, I think the sort of cost comparison one was the last question anyway, and I think we'd quickly talked about third-party tools. The one I was thinking of actually was Nerdio, so that's one that we use sometimes. We'll actually price it and configure it and deploy it for you, but there's obviously a cost associated with that. So there are some third-party tools out there. As I say, while you're off the call, Andy, I just said that we'd compile those questions into the Q&A document and share them. I was just coming on to this last slide really that summarised the 3 things that you went through. So resilience is your hybrid benefit.
Sorry, Mark. Just before you do, because I was mid-example when I dropped off. So just to finish that particular example, this customer wanted added resiliency and to put their toe in the water in Azure. So span up their server, VPN to site, and we allowed their domain to propagate across to a second domain controller up in Azure. So that gives them that added resiliency if their primary goes down. And what we've done is we've taken their storage that was basically very seldomly accessed, and we've moved it into the cool storage tier in Azure to basically save them, well, an awful lot of storage on their SAN. So they've got their toe in Azure, and it's there for them to expand and utilize as they need. So that's one method of moving into Azure.
Okay, no worries. So yeah, I think I've covered that. I was just talking about runbook automation, and that's obviously a whole subject on its own. And, you obviously need to be careful, but that's obviously we had the blip early on in the pandemic with a customer of ours, but generally, that should work well. And obviously one of the key benefits of Azure, and again the cost savings you can make, is by spinning up and spinning down those services when you don't need them. And again, we use that ability a lot, particularly with sort of things like RDS servers over a weekend when people don't need them, as an example. So I think we've covered that one. So at least on the plus side, a couple of lessons that we've learned today. One is that we're actually delivering this live. So if those of you thought that we just pre-canned a recording and it's just live. And secondly, make sure you bring your power with you. So just very quickly moving on to a summary of what else we've got on this week. Obviously this is the 5th, so we've already run 4 different sessions, some fairly hands-on, some a little bit more high level commercial. I think, Sean, that we can let people access these if they register for the content. So obviously we've recorded each of these sessions and made them available through our hub along with all of the collateral. So obviously we'll do the same for this session today. We've got another final one this afternoon, which is called Deploying Teams Best Practice. So that is around, as it says on the tin, best practice around deploying teams, so security, structure, document sharing. And we've also got an intro from one of the guys from the Microsoft 365 product team in the UK for that session as well. So that's at 2 o'clock this afternoon if anybody's interested in jumping on that. As I say, the recording will be available after this event, and Sean will be in touch with you to make sure that you also fill in the form that gives you an entry into the prize draw for the Surface Go 2. So make sure you do that. And I think that's the end, unless there's any other questions popped into the chat Sean or Kirsty?
I've just had a look, Mark. I can't see any now. I think, we've
Sean's
covered
just
that.
posted Sean's just posted the link in for the event this afternoon if anybody's interested in the Teams deployment workshop. Otherwise, if there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up there. So, Andy, thanks for all your time and your wisdom on the Azure Calculator, everything you need to know about Azure. Obviously, if there's anything further we can help you guys with, then please get in touch. Sean will send our contact details through if you don't already have them, or just go to risksolutions.com and you can get in touch with us through that method. And obviously, if there's anything you want to go into a bit more detail around, we can help you. So appreciate your time and attention. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your help.
Thank you.